It was supposed to be just another day at the African Union Summit. Suits, speeches, and diplomatic smiles. Delegates had gathered from all across the continent to discuss the usual trade, development, climate, and cooperation. But no one, not a single person, in that grand hall in Addis Ababa was prepared for what would unfold next. The stage was polished, the lighting pristine. Interpreters stood by, cameras rolled quietly, and the air buzzed with the weight of formality. And then, as if pulled from the pages of an unwritten history book, something changed. In the midst of a panel on Africa's strategic future, the conversation took a sharp, unexpected turn. Helen, a well-known South African political figure and former leader of the Democratic Alliance, took the microphone. Her words were sharp, deliberate, and unapologetic. She warned of what she called a dangerous rise in anti-Western sentiment sweeping across Africa, especially among younger leaders. And she didn't speak in generalities. With a calm voice that barely masked the sting behind it, she pointed her criticism directly at the youngest head of state in the room, President Ibrahim of Burkina Faso. Her words cut through the air. Leaders like President Troy are chasing illusions of sovereignty, isolating their nations, and rejecting decades of Western partnership. You don't build Africa by burning bridges to the world. The room went still. Some nodded, others shifted in their seats. For a moment, it felt like time itself hesitated. Zil had always been known for her willingness to say what others wouldn't. But this time, her words didn't just challenge a policy. They challenged a movement, a growing tide of young African voices calling for independence, dignity, and a future defined not by old alliances, but by African hands. That's when he stood up. President Ibrahim Traoré. Steady, calm, no microphone in hand yet. But the room turned toward him, like gravity itself had shifted. There was no script, no warning, just a stillness so thick. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. No one knew what he would say. But somehow, everyone knew this wasn't going to be politics, as usual. This was going to be something else. Something unforgettable. The silence didn't last long. With practiced poise and a calmness that almost seemed rehearsed, Helen leaned slightly into her microphone. She adjusted her scarf, took a sip of water, and then, in front of the entire African Union Assembly, launched into what would become one of the most talked about speeches in recent memory. I understand the passion of today's youth, she began, her voice crisp and controlled. But passion without perspective is a dangerous thing. She paused, letting her words settle into the room, like dust on marble. There is an alarming rise of populism in Africa, this fantasy of complete autonomy, of cutting ties with the West, of standing alone. And I fear that it's being led by individuals too young to remember the price we've already paid for such dreams. Then she turned directly toward President Troy, her words now sharpened to a blade. You, Mr. President, are leading your nation down a path of isolation. Sovereignty is not built by severing partnerships. It's not built by rejecting those who stood beside us when we needed help the most. The West has been our partner for decades, and now you dismiss them. You call them colonizers, exploiters, when in truth, they've offered Africa trade, aid, and opportunity. Zil's tone was not angry, but it carried the unmistakable force of accusation. We cannot build Africa by burning bridges, she repeated. We cannot rise while turning our backs on the very hands that reached out to help us. Murmurs filled the hall. Some delegates nodded. Others looked away. Uncomfortable. The older generation, those who had sat at tables with Western donors and diplomats for decades, found her message familiar, almost comforting. But among the youth delegates, there was a shift. Phones were lifted. Eyes narrowed. Some whispered to each other. They had heard this message before, over and over again, and many were tired of it. Still, Helen's ill wasn't finished. These young leaders, she continued, with their slogans and social media clips, may get applause for their speeches, but applause doesn't feed a nation. Dreams don't build roads. Pride doesn't keep the lights on. She set down her notes with quiet finality. We must choose realism over revolution, diplomacy over defiance. Her final words echoed off the high ceilings of the summit hall. We must remember who our friends truly are. And just like that, she sat back, hands folded in her lap, as if nothing controversial had been said. But the spark had already been lit. Every eye turned now not to her, but to the man she had called out by name, President Ibrahim Troy. He hadn't flinched once, but the fire in his eyes had just begun to rise. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. But when President Ibrahim Troy stood, it felt like the room itself stood with him. Every camera in the hall tilted. Every head turned. His suit was simple. No flash. But his presence unmistakable. Calm. Rooted. Resolute. And when he began to speak, his voice didn't just carry it settled. Like thunder rolling in the distance. Madam Sill. He began. Eyes locked on hers. You speak of bridges as though we haven't crossed them 1,000 times, only to find ourselves robbed, lectured, and left in chains. You could hear a pin drop. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. You speak of democracy. But your own party, he continued, has inherited the leftovers of apartheid. You tell us the West offered trade and opportunity, but at what cost? Who owned the land after those opportunities? Who made the rules? Who kept the profit? There was no insult, no name-calling, just history, raw and unvarnished. You say we turn our backs on the West. No, madam, we are finally turning toward ourselves. A murmur swept through the room, not of dissent, but recognition. Our people, he said, have been fed promises for generations. Loans dressed up as aid, debt disguised as partnership. And when we speak of reclaiming what is ours, we are told we're ungrateful. He paused. The silence pressed in tighter. Africa, he said, does not need guardians. It needs justice. Those words, just 4 of them, shifted the energy in the room. Zill sat motionless, but her lips pressed tightly together. You are not here to save us. Troy continued. You are here to remind us of the version of Africa you wish we'd accept: docile, dependent, deferential. But that Africa is gone. He turned his gaze now, slowly, across the hall to every delegate, every ambassador, every youth leader watching in awe. Africa will not rise by echoing old voices. It will rise when we find the courage to speak our own. And just like that, he stepped back. No theatrics, no fist pounding, just truth. And the room, it didn't erupt. It exhaled, because in that moment, something far more powerful than applause happened. The silence told the story, a silence filled with realization, and the beginning of something No one in that room, especially Helen was prepared to face. A new chapter had begun. When President Troy returned to his seat, the room didn't know what to do with itself. No one clapped. No one spoke. Even the moderator, normally quick to steer the conversation forward, paused, as if unsure whether the program should continue or simply end right there. Helen, still seated at the panelist table, looked frozen. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her glass of water. But she didn't drink. She didn't speak. The fire she had started had come back to burn her quietly. Without smoke. Without rage. Just truth. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. For those in the room, especially the younger delegates from countries like Guinea, Mali, Kenya, and even South Africa. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion. It comes from understanding, from witnessing a shift. One by one, phones came up not to scroll, not to distract, but to record, to remember. Across the room, youth representatives looked at each other and nodded, some mouthing the words, "Finally." A few stood, not dramatically, but with quiet reverence, recognizing that they had just witnessed more than a political disagreement. They had witnessed a generational handoff. The moderator eventually broke the stillness. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the tension that lingered in the air. "Thank you, President Troy, and thank you to all our panelists. Due to time constraints, we must move forward to the next session, but it was too late. The moment had already claimed its place in history." As delegates moved to the lobby for the next panel, conversations buzzed, but not about economic forecasts or trade agreements. They were talking about one thing the moment Ibrahim Troy silenced the room, not by overpowering, but by revealing. Some African leaders, the older ones, were clearly shaken. They had spent decades carefully managing relationships with Western donors and institutions. To see one of their own, one so young, challenge that dynamic so openly, so confidently, was jarring. Meanwhile, the youth were energized. Their posture changed, their steps quicker, their voices louder. Not in volume, but in conviction. Something had shifted. And somewhere in the middle of that crowd, Helen exited quietly. She didn't give interviews. She didn't stay for the networking sessions. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one driving the conversation. Because now, the world wasn't asking what Helen had said. They were asking, who is Ibrahim Troy, and more importantly, what comes next? It didn't take long. Within hours, clips of President Troy's statement flooded every major social media platform. TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, even corners of Facebook that rarely buzzed with political chatter, were lit up with one shared message: Africa had found its voice. The hashtags trended fast: number, Africa Rising; number, Troy speech; number, New Africa. And this wasn't just digital noise. It was something else. Something real. You could feel it. In university cafeterias in Nairobi, students paused their meals to re-watch the speech, nodding between bites. In the streets of Dakar, a group of young entrepreneurs spray-painted a wall mural of President Troy, with the words, "Not another generation," in silence. In Johannesburg, even South Africa's own youth delegates who had attended the summit posted long reflections in support of Troy, some subtly, others boldly. He had become more than a president in that moment. He was a mirror for millions of young Africans who had grown up feeling unheard, overlooked, and talked down to Troy's words weren't just inspiring. They were validating. They were real. Because for too long, Africa's narrative had been shaped outside of Africa, its story told by outsiders, its potential defined by metrics set in boardrooms continents away. But now, that script was being rewritten, and the pen was finally in African hands. Activists began quoting Troy at rallies. Artists sampled his words into music tracks. Teachers played clips in classrooms, letting students debate what it meant to turn toward ourselves. What had started as a panel session at a diplomatic summit was now a continent-wide conversation, and it wasn't just the young who were listening. Elders, too, those who had lived through independence struggles and watched their nations dance between hope and hardship, were watching with cautious curiosity. Some feared the fire Troy had lit might burn bridges. Others quietly admitted it might be the fire needed to clear a path. Meanwhile, Troy himself remained quiet. No follow-up press conference. No media victory lap. Just silence. Because he understood something deeply. The words had already done their job. The message had landed. This wasn't about one man's speech. It was about a generation waking up to the sound of its own voice. And for the first time in a long time, that voice wasn't asking to be heard. It was simply speaking, and the world had no choice but to listen. As the summit came to a close, the world beyond the African Union's walls began to take notice. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Some framed it as a diplomatic embarrassment. Others called it a breakthrough. Pundits debated Troy's words on late-night panels. Political commentators offered hot takes from studios in London, New York, and Paris. But no matter the spin, the same clip kept playing. The moment Ibrahim Troy calmly, fearlessly redefined Africa's role on the world stage, not everyone was cheering. In the capitals of the West, Washington, Brussels, London, unease set in. Foreign policy circles whispered about instability. Think tanks drafted quiet memos titled with words like containment and realignment. To them, Troy's words weren't just passionate, they were disruptive. Because if Africa no longer played by the old rules, if it no longer waited for permission, then what did that mean for the balance of global power? Business leaders, too, raised eyebrows. Investors who had long seen Africa as a developing market began asking harder questions. Would Troy's stance inspire other leaders? Would this mean more regulations, more independence, less control? For some, it was a warning sign. For others, it was long overdue. Back on the continent, the divide deepened. Two narratives emerged. The first was filled with pride. Young Africans saw a leader unafraid to confront the weight of history. They saw strength, dignity, and courage. To them, Troy was not isolating Africa. He was liberating it, freeing it from old contracts, old mindsets, old systems that had promised progress but delivered dependency. The second narrative, however, sounded the alarm. Critics called Troy's speech dangerous, irresponsible. They argued that in a world more connected than ever, cutting ties with Western allies could lead to devastating consequences: economic downturns, foreign investment pullback, diplomatic tension. This isn't how you lead. One analyst said on a global news panel, "This is how you light fires you can't put out." The debate swept across dinner tables, schoolrooms, parliament halls. Everyone had a take. But one thing was certain: the conversation had changed. No longer were African leaders merely reacting to external agendas. They were setting their own, whether you agreed with Troy or not. You couldn't deny the impact. He had forced a continent and a world to look inward, to ask uncomfortable questions, to challenge assumptions that had stood untested for decades. And in doing so, he had sparked something far bigger than himself. Not a revolution of fists or flames, but of ideas. And ideas, once spoken aloud, have a way of never going back to sleep. Back home in Burkina Faso, the echoes of Ibrahim Troy's speech weren't fading. They were just beginning to take root. Unlike many leaders who stir emotions with powerful words, but return to the status quo, Troy followed his speech with something far more potent action. Within weeks of the summit, his government rolled out a bold economic initiative focused on intra-African trade, bypassing traditional systems controlled by Western institutions. No more waiting for approval from global banks. No more terms dictated from afar. This time, it would be Africa to Africa goods, knowledge, and opportunity flowing within the continent. Troy also launched a nationwide program aimed at youth employment, targeting rural communities where joblessness had long been dismissed as inevitable. The plan was simple: teach, train, and trust. Not charity, not dependency, just access, investment, and belief. Factories once silent were reopened. Markets once overlooked were revitalized. Partnerships were inked not in French or English boardrooms, but between farmers in Mali and engineers in Ghana. The continent, I long told it was too fractured to unify, began to whisper back, "Watch us." The West, they watched, with curiosity, with concern, with confusion. This wasn't the Africa their reports had described. This wasn't the compliant continent waiting in line for aid. This was a continent moving fast and not asking for directions. Still, critics remained vocal. Some economists warned of short-term volatility. Self-reliance sounds noble, they said, but it's not realistic. Others worried about how the shift would impact foreign investors. Would they pull out? Would economies suffer? But the people of Burkina Faso didn't seem afraid, because for the first time in a long time, the plan wasn't written somewhere else. It wasn't approved by outside consultants. It came from within, from a president who had once been a soldier, a youth activist, and now something more. To many, Troy had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. In villages, murals were painted with his words, "Africa doesn't need permission to rise." In schools, teachers asked students to write essays on sovereignty. In homes, parents told their children stories about the man who spoke up and meant it. The skeptics called it reckless, but to the people walking the dusty roads of Ouagadougou, the ones who had waited decades for something to change, it didn't feel reckless at all. It felt like sunrise. Because when you've spent a lifetime waiting for someone to open the door for you, there's something liberating about building your own. By now, the world had stopped wondering if something was happening in Africa. They were beginning to understand that it already had. President Ibrahim Troy's name had become a fixture in conversations far beyond the continent. Not because he courted attention, but because he refused to play by the old rules. He didn't just speak. He acted, and through that action, a new identity for Africa began to take shape, not just politically or economically, but emotionally. It was no longer about defiance. It was about dignity. In interviews, young Africans spoke of Troy not as a savior, but as a reflection. He says what we feel. One woman from Senegal shared on a live stream, He doesn't speak above us. He speaks from where we are. That connection, raw, honest, and unfiltered, had never been part of the political language many had grown up with. Troy had changed that. And while Western critics continued to debate his impact on global markets or geopolitical stability, everyday people were asking simpler questions. What if we actually can do this ourselves? What if we don't need a blueprint drawn by someone else? What if this is the beginning of something we've been waiting for? Troy didn't offer all answers. He didn't pretend to. But what he did offer was something far more powerful: permission to believe. In the months following the summit, regional forums across Africa shifted in tone. Leaders who once hesitated to speak too boldly about sovereignty began to reference Troy's speech. Some cautiously, others with full voice. And while unity across Africa remained complex, diverse languages, histories, and interests, there was now a thread connecting them all. The belief that Africa's story was not over, that the best chapters had not yet been written. That thread was strong enough to pull voices together, and loud enough to drown out the silence that had held the continent back for generations. Back in Burkina Faso, Troy continued his work, not behind podiums, but in rural clinics, in youth employment centers, in gatherings where no camera was present. He knew the summit would be remembered, but he also knew something deeper. History isn't written in speeches. It's written in what comes next. And across the continent, from crowded markets in Lagos to quiet classrooms in Windhoek, people were already answering that call in their own way, in their own voice. They weren't waiting for permission. They were moving. And the world, for once, was the one trying to catch up.